Wait a second. How does a soap spoiler cycle turn into a story about a woman stabbing a man in his own home, hiding upstairs while he bleeds out on the floor, then trying to convince police that his wife did it, all while that same man literally flatlines before paramedics shock him back to life? And somehow that is still not the whole story, because underneath the blood on the Abbott Mansion floor, there is another mess unfolding at the exact same time. Victor Newman trying to control Nikki's recovery after her devastating medical crisis, Billy Abbott spiraling through old family wounds just as Jill suddenly reappears wanting to fix years of damage, and Phyllis heading straight toward a romantic disaster that could blow up half of Genoa City. What makes these 2 weeks of Young and the Restless so wild is not just that Jack Abbott's life is on the line. It's that nearly every major family in town is being pushed into a pressure cooker at once. And the more you look at these spoilers for July 6th through July 17th, the more it starts to feel like one giant question hanging over Genoa City. Who still has control of this story, and who is about to lose everything? I'm Anderson, this is Soap Pulse, and if you love deep dive soap breakdowns with all the twists, motives, and fallout laid out piece by piece, hit like, subscribe, and stick with me, because this one gets darker, stranger, and messier the further we go. Let's start with the event that detonates the entire 2-week stretch, because everything else almost bends around it. Monday, July 6th opens with one of the most chaotic Abbott family scenes in recent memory. Diane and Kyle come home and find Jack bleeding out on the floor of the mansion. Not wounded, not barely hurt, bleeding out, and in true Genoa City fashion, the emergency itself is horrifying enough, but the details around it are even more disturbing. Kyle calls 911 only to learn that someone has already made the call. Think about how eerie that is for a second. Jack is lying there fighting for his life. Diane and Kyle are just arriving, and somewhere in the background there is already evidence that someone knew exactly what had happened before they walked through the door. That immediately narrows suspicion, and according to the spoilers, Diane and Kyle are convinced Patty is the one who attacked Jack. Now, if you've watched this show for any length of time, you already know why that matters. Patty is not just another random antagonist passing through town. Patty represents chaos with a personal history attached to it. She has emotional ties to this family, old obsessions, and a pattern of behavior that makes every scene she enters feel unstable. So when the EMTs arrive and Detective Burrow gets involved, Kyle doesn't hesitate. He tells the detective that Patty stabbed his father. He also explains that he just rescued Diane, who had already been reported missing. That detail matters because it means this isn't a simple attack scene. There was already another thread in motion before Jack hit the floor. Diane was missing. Kyle was pulling her out of danger. And when they return home, they walk into what looks like the aftermath of a nightmare. Then the story takes another turn. The police find Patty upstairs, hiding behind a bed. Not running, not gone. Still inside the house, and she has slashed herself. That is where the entire narrative becomes less about a straightforward assault and more about competing versions of reality. Because Patty's response, according to the spoilers, is not fear or remorse, it's accusation. She claims Diane attacked both her and Jack because Jack had left Diane for Patty, and if that sounds delusional, manipulative, or both, that's because the show clearly wants viewers sitting in that uncertainty and anger at the same time. Patty is not just trying to escape consequences. She's trying to rewrite the story while Jack is still dying in the same building. And yes, dying is the right word here, because the spoilers say Jack actually dies on the floor. He flatlines. EMTs have to shock him back to life. That is not a tease. That is a full-on life or death cliff edge at the very start of the week. So now the emotional stakes for the Abbott family are obvious, but the investigative stakes are just as important. Jack is the victim. He is also potentially the only person who can fully confirm what happened. But if he's unconscious, in surgery, or too weak to talk, then the vacuum gets filled by whoever speaks loudest. And Patty clearly intends to speak first. There's also a very human reaction built into the middle of this chaos. When the police escort Patty downstairs, Diane goes after her and Kyle has to physically pull Diane off. That moment tells you almost everything about Diane's state of mind. She has just returned home, found her husband near death, and now the woman she believes caused it is standing there trying to frame her. It is rage, terror, helplessness, and humiliation all collapsing at once. And from a storytelling standpoint, that matters because it creates exactly the kind of image prosecutors, police, and enemies can twist if they want to. A furious wife lunging at the accused attacker may be emotionally understandable, but in a town like Genoa City, understandable and useful are not the same thing. Patty then makes an even more grotesque move. She wants to ride in the ambulance with Jack. Kyle shuts that down immediately, telling her there is no way she's going near his father. Burrow, meanwhile, decides neither Patty nor Diane can leave the mansion until he sorts things out. And that right there is where the first major tension loop of these spoilers really locks in. Because if Jack is in no condition to speak, then for at least some stretch of time, Diane and Patty become two women trapped in the same legal and emotional orbit, one claiming victimhood and the other trying not to become the scapegoat in her own husband's attempted murder case. By Tuesday, July 7th, Jack's condition is still critical. He has already died once. He needs emergency surgery. The danger hasn't passed. In fact, the spoilers suggest the real story may be just beginning because somehow Patty manages to gain leverage in this situation. And that's the part viewers should pay close attention to. It's one thing for Patty to throw out a lie in the immediate aftermath of a crime scene. It's another thing entirely if she finds a way to make that lie stick long enough to complicate the investigation. Diane has a strong alibi on paper. She was with Kyle when they came home and found Jack together. But soaps thrive on emotional contamination, witness doubt, and procedural confusion. If Patty argues Kyle is lying to protect Diane, or if she drags other names into the mess to muddy the timeline, suddenly the issue is no longer whether Patty is believable. It's whether she can create enough confusion to buy herself room. And that seems to be exactly where the story is heading, because by Wednesday, July 8th, spoilers indicate Patty has some kind of leverage she can use to force Jack to stay quiet. That line should set off alarms for anyone following this storyline closely. Jack is the stabbing victim, so what possible leverage could Patty have over him after he nearly dies? Is it emotional leverage? A threat against Diane? Some secret she can weaponize? The spoilers don't spell it out, and honestly, that's one of the strongest hooks in the entire 2-week run. If Jack survives the surgery and wakes up able to identify his attacker, logic says the story should be over. But the show is telling us it won't be over. Something is going to interfere with that clean resolution. Something is going to keep Patty in the game longer than anyone around Jack would want. And that is where Diane's nightmare may deepen. Because if Patty can't win by proving Diane attacked Jack, she may still be able to win by keeping the accusation alive. The fact that Michael is reportedly pleading with Christine on Wednesday suggests legal consequences may be on the table. The most obvious read is that Michael is trying to stop Christine from filing charges or taking Patty's claims seriously. And if that is the case, then Diane's problem is no longer just surviving a domestic horror story. It's surviving the possibility that the justice system gets pulled into Patty's fantasy. For Diane, that would be devastating. She's not simply trying to nurse Jack through a medical crisis. She may also have to defend herself from an accusation built by a woman with a long history of instability, but just enough personal connection to make every lie feel dangerous. Now step back for a moment and look at the emotional architecture here. Jack is literally on the road between life and death. Ashley is set to return home from Paris later in the week to see him. Kyle is caught between protecting his mother, defending his father, and dealing with police scrutiny. Diane is trying not to implode while the woman she blames for all of this keeps finding ways to stay relevant. And Patty, rather than fading into custody as a one-episode villain, continues to haunt Jack and Diane's marriage even into the week of July 13th through 17th. That tells us the real story here is not just the stabbing, it's the aftershock. It's the way a single act of violence destabilizes the entire Abbott family ecosystem and turns recovery into another battleground. But the Abbott crisis is only one side of the July chaos, because at the exact same time, the Newman world is unraveling in a very different way. Nikki is struggling under her new circumstances after her medical crisis, and all signs point to her blindness remaining a major issue through this stretch of episodes. Victor, in typical Victor fashion, makes an unexpected move regarding her post-hospital care. The likely implication is that he brings Nikki home to the ranch and sets up her recovery there. On paper, that sounds supportive, maybe even loving. But this is where history matters. Nikki had expected, or at least may have expected, to return to the Genoa City Athletic Club. Instead, Victor appears ready to reclaim control of the situation by bringing her back under his roof. And the reason this feels so loaded is because Victor doesn't operate in a vacuum. He operates through power, through logistics, decisions, timing, and the assumption that he knows what is best before anyone else gets a vote. If Nikki is walked through the front door of the new ranch by Victoria and Nick, viewers are going to be asking a very simple question. Did Nikki agree to this, or was this arranged around her? That difference matters. There's a huge emotional gap between a husband creating a safe place for his wife to heal and a husband quietly repositioning her in a place where he controls the terms of her recovery. That tension gets even more interesting because Victor is not an innocent bystander in the broader Abbott chaos. The spoilers strongly suggest that once Nikki learns what Patty did to Jack, Victor's role in unleashing Patty on the Abbotts will become impossible to ignore. That is the kind of reveal that can poison an already fragile recovery environment. Imagine Nikki trying to process blindness, dependence, fear, and a completely altered daily life, only to discover that the man now presenting himself as her protector may also be responsible for setting a violent disaster in motion elsewhere. Suddenly, the ranch is not just a sanctuary. It becomes a stage for guilt, resentment, and the question of whether Victor's efforts are acts of love or acts of damage control. Friday, July 10th brings another layer when Victor stuns everyone with a new announcement. The spoilers don't tell us exactly what that announcement is, but they do tell us everybody is still reeling from it into the following week. That suggests something bigger than a routine family decision. It could be business-related, it could be tied to Chancellor, it could involve Nikki, or even a broader restructuring of power around the families currently in crisis. But what makes it compelling is the timing. Victor is making a major move at the exact moment Jack is fighting to recover, Nikki is struggling to adapt to blindness, and Billy is facing a crossroads with Jill. In other words, Victor is not just reacting to events. He may be trying to seize the narrative while everyone else is vulnerable. And that brings us to Billy, because if Jack's story is the physical emergency of these spoilers and Nikki's is the emotional one, Billy's might be the psychological one. The language around him is revealing. He's dealing with deep-seated mommy issues, which in soap terms usually means we're about to revisit every unresolved wound between Billy and Jill while pretending this is only about a job offer or a family visit. Jill appears determined to repair the relationship. Billy, on the other hand, doubts her intentions. That skepticism is not random bitterness. It's earned history. If someone has rejected your calls for months and then suddenly arrives wanting closeness, wanting family unity, maybe even wanting you back in the Chancellor orbit, of course the first question is why now? This is where the story gets more subtle than the Jack attack, but potentially just as important long-term. Jill is not just stopping by to admire Billy and Sally's house decor. She is stepping back into a son's life at a moment when he is vulnerable, professionally uncertain, and emotionally primed to either reconnect or explode. By Thursday, July 9th, spoilers say Jill won't rest until she and Billy fix their relationship. That sounds warm on the surface. It also sounds like pressure, because reconciliation in soaps is rarely clean. There are always conditions, unspoken expectations, and stratatorno. And the broader speculation surrounding Billy is that he may ultimately accept a role at Chancellor, possibly alongside Holden. If that happens, Jill's visit is not just maternal healing, it's a pivot point in Billy's future. Now add Lily and Kane to that equation, and suddenly Chancellor starts to look like the center of a larger reorganization. Lily is letting her guard down with Kane again. She experiences a different side of him. There are hints of Kane offering Holden a job at Chancellor, and by the week of July 13th through 17th, Lily and Kane are essentially moving back toward official couple status, with the possibility of things turning physical again. On one level, that is classic soap romance revival. On another, it's a power story. Kane and Lily reuniting doesn't just affect their personal lives, it potentially reshapes business alliances, family loyalties, and Billy's place in the same orbit. And that is what makes this spoiler batch feel more layered than a simple set of weekly beats. Nearly every romantic development is tied to a power structure. Jill reconnecting with Billy is tied to Chancellor. Lily reconnecting with Kane may be tied to Chancellor. Victor's announcement may impact the same ecosystem. Jack's attack destabilizes the Abbott side of town, which then opens emotional and strategic space for everyone else to move. It's one big domino field. Then there is the Phyllis situation, which might be the most uncomfortable but socially combustible subplot in the whole bunch. On Monday, Phyllis tells Matt he needs to get away from Victor and that Kane is not going to respond well to the way Matt is approaching him. Matt flirts. He flatters. He admits he can't fully trust Phyllis because she betrayed him before. And despite all of that, he asks her out for drinks at the Shadow Room and eventually lands a date. That alone is enough to get fans talking. But the real bomb comes later when the spoilers for the following week say Phyllis and Matt get closer and Nick walks in on them in a compromising position. That is the kind of moment that can set off three different stories at once. First, it creates obvious fallout for Phyllis and Nick, especially if there are still unresolved feelings or protective instincts there. Second, it potentially triggers a relapse or emotional spiral for Nick if the stress of Nikki's medical situation, Victor's manipulations, and Phyllis making chaotic romantic choices all hit at once. And third, it creates one of those deeply polarizing fan response storylines where the actual event matters less than what it says about the character making it. Is Phyllis self-sabotaging? Is she trying to feel chosen? Is she manipulating a situation? Or is she simply moving toward the one person who makes sense to her in a moment when everyone else is unstable? Depending on where you stand, the answer changes. And while all of that is happening, another triangle of tension keeps heating up in the background: Audra, Sienna, and Noah. Audra shows up, Sienna immediately gets territorial, insults are exchanged, and Noah is stuck in the middle trying to calm everybody down while making almost nothing cleaner. Sienna reminds Audra she is Noah's girlfriend. Audra's answer is essentially, "For now." That is not subtle. That is a warning shot. And what makes it interesting is that the show appears to be leaning into Noah's passivity as part of the problem. He doesn't seem eager to fully shut Audra down. So the tension isn't just two women competing, it's one man allowing emotional ambiguity to continue because part of him may still be entertaining it. That matters because it mirrors the broader pattern of these 2 weeks. Almost every major character is dealing with a situation that would be easier if someone just made a clean, honest choice, and almost nobody does. Victor doesn't simply support Nikki, he controls the environment. Billy doesn't simply hear Jill out, he questions her motives while inching toward the very world she represents. Jack, if Patty truly has leverage over him, may not be able to tell the truth, even after nearly dying. Noah doesn't fully close the door on Audra. Phyllis steps into a relationship that is practically designed to explode. These are not isolated plot points. They are variations on the same theme, people trying to manage crisis while leaving one dangerous door open. By the time we reach the second week, the emotional center of the story shifts from shock to consequence. Jack is alive, but alive is not the same as safe. Recovery is slow. Patty is still causing problems for Jack and Diane's marriage. Ashley reconnects with family, but her return doesn't sound like a permanent stabilizing force. Nikki is still struggling with her new normal, still without her sight. And Victor stepping up may already be too little, too late if trust has started to erode. Billy's future remains tied to whether Jill's return was really about love, legacy, or leverage. Lily and Kane appear ready to stop dancing around each other and become a couple again, and all of it sits under the shadow of Victor's announcement, which everyone is still reacting to. So what is really going on in these spoilers? Underneath the stabbing, the surgeries, the jealousy, the flirting, and the family reunions, the show seems to be building a larger summer argument about control. Who gets to control the story after violence? Patty tries to control the narrative of Jack's attack. Victor tries to control Nikki's recovery and maybe the broader business landscape too. Jill tries to control the terms of her reconciliation with Billy. Audra tries to control access to Noah. Phyllis tries to control a situation that may end up controlling her instead. Even the people who look powerless are still fighting over narrative space. Diane wants the truth to be obvious. Nikki wants dignity in the middle of dependence. Billy wants to decide whether family history gets to define his future. Jack may simply want the right to tell the truth about what happened to him if he's allowed to. And that's why the biggest reveal in these 2 weeks may not be any single twist. It may be the realization that Genoa City is entering one of those periods where everybody's unresolved issue is colliding at once. The Abbott family is dealing with bloodshed and attempted manipulation. The Newmans are dealing with physical loss, guilt, and the consequences of Victor's choices. Chancellor may be quietly reshuffling around Billy, Jill, Lily, Kane, and Holden, and the romantic subplots are not distractions from that chaos. They are fuel for it. If there's one thing to watch most closely as this all unfolds, it's Jack's voice. Not just whether he survives, because the spoilers make clear he does survive the immediate crisis, but whether he gets to speak freely afterward. If Patty really has leverage, if Diane really faces legal danger, if Victor's earlier actions really come back to poison Nikki's trust, then Jack telling the truth becomes more than a medical milestone. It becomes the moral hinge of the entire storyline. Because once the victim can speak, everyone else's version of events gets tested. Patty's fantasy, Diane's fear, Kyle's loyalty, Victor's culpability, even the emotional priorities of the people circling the Abbott family crisis, all of it changes if Jack can finally say exactly what happened and refuse to be manipulated into silence. And that is why these Young and the Restless spoilers for July 6th through 17th feel so explosive. Not because the show is simply stacking twists for the sake of chaos, but because every twist is aimed at the same pressure point. What happens when people who already have years of secrets, resentment, obsession, and family damage are suddenly forced to respond to a genuine emergency? Some people become caretakers, some become strategists, some become liars, some become desperate, and some reveal that the most dangerous thing about them was never the act itself. It was what they were willing to do afterward to control the fallout. So now the big questions are set. Can Diane survive Patty's accusations without losing Jack in the process anyway? Will Jack expose Patty, or will whatever leverage she has keep him trapped even after he wakes up? Is Victor's effort to care for Nikki an act of love, an act of guilt, or both? Will Nikki forgive him if she learns just how much of this disaster traces back to his choices? Is Billy actually walking toward a new chapter, or just back into the same emotional machinery that has broken him before? And when Nick finds Phyllis with Matt, does that become just another messy soap triangle or the beginning of a much uglier collapse? That's the thing about this particular 2-week run. The stabbing gets your attention. Jack flatlining keeps it. But the aftermath is what could make this stretch memorable. Because once the ambulance leaves, once the surgery begins, once the shouting dies down and the legal questions start, the real story becomes the one every great soap tries to tell. Not just who got hurt, but who everybody becomes in response to the hurt. And if these spoilers are any indication, Genoa City is about to show us that survival and damage are not opposites. Sometimes they happen at the exact same time,